Hello everyone, wishing you a beautiful and peaceful day. Today, we're about to discover a story that begins with fear in the middle of a crowded spring market, and one unexpected stranger who changed everything. Why was he the only one who dared to step forward when everyone else stayed silent? Stay with us to find out. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The market noise felt far away in Tieu Lac's ears. Only a few moments ago, the whole spring market had been full of life. Festival music drifted through the air. Vendors called out their prices. Children laughed as they tugged at their mother's sleeves. But now, standing there with her basket clutched tightly in both hands, Tieu Lac barely heard any of it. In front of her were only the two young men, their smiles lazy and ugly, their eyes full of trouble. Her heart was pounding so hard it almost hurt. One of them leaned closer, speaking in that mocking voice that made her skin crawl. "Why are you so scared? We just want to talk." The other laughed and tapped one of the candy skewers. "Or maybe you don't know how to treat customers properly." A few people nearby glanced over. No one stepped in. Tieu Lac tried to steady her breathing. "Please move aside," she said softly. "I still need to sell." The taller one smirked. "Sell? With that face? You should be grateful we're even paying attention to you." The two of them laughed together, and the sound made her chest tighten. She instinctively stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. Behind her was the stall wall and the narrow corner where she had set down her basket. In front of her, the two men stood close enough to trap her without ever touching her. At least, that was what she thought. Then a new voice cut through the moment. "Hey, put that down." It wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to stop everything for a second. All three of them turned. A young man stood a few steps away, half in sunlight, half under the shadow of the market roof. His clothes were dusty and stained, as if he had been working all day. One sleeve was rolled up higher than the other. There was dirt on his shirt and a dark streak of grease near his cuff. His hair was messy, his face damp with sweat, and at first glance, he didn't look like anyone important. But he had done the one thing no one else had done. He had stopped. He had seen what was happening and chosen not to walk away. The shorter troublemaker gave a mocking smile. "And who are you supposed to be?" The young man ignored the question. His eyes were on the skewer still in one man's hand. "I said, put it down. If you want to buy, pay for it. If not, leave her alone." Tieu Lac stared at him. She had never seen him before. At least, she didn't think so. But there was something steady in the way he stood, as if he had already decided he would not move just because someone tried to scare him. The taller one sneered. "This doesn't concern you." The stranger answered calmly. "It does now." The words were simple, but they struck Tieu Lac deeply. For the first time since the two men had cornered her, the fear inside her loosened just a little. The danger was still there, but now she was no longer facing it completely alone. The two young men exchanged a glance. Then the taller one stepped forward. "You think you're some kind of hero because you came over here?" The stranger didn't move. "No, I just don't like seeing two men bully one girl in the middle of a market." A few more people turned to look now. Still, no one came closer. The shorter troublemaker laughed. "Bully? We were just talking." "Then stand farther away and talk," the young man replied. That answer irritated them immediately. The taller one tossed the half-eaten skewer back into the basket and stepped close enough that he was nearly chest to chest with him. "And if we don't?" For a second, no one spoke. Tieu Lac could hear the distant music again, strangely cheerful against the tension building right in front of her. She noticed the stranger's eyes flick briefly past the two men, scanning the market. He was thinking, watching. Then he said quietly, "If you don't, this won't end well for you." The taller one barked out a laugh. "Listen to this guy." And with that, the last bit of pretending disappeared. The shorter one shoved the young man's shoulder. Not enough to knock him down, but enough to show they were ready to use force. The stranger took half a step back, regained his balance, and stayed calm. Tieu Lac gasped. People nearby looked over sharply, but even then, most of them only watched. In a crowded market, trouble had a strange way of creating empty space around itself. Everyone wanted to see. No one wanted to be involved. The taller troublemaker cracked his neck and smirked. "What now? You want to fight for her?" For the first time, the young man glanced at Tieu Lac. It was only a brief look, but it said something clearly. "Don't panic." Then he looked back at them and said, "No, I want both of you to leave before you make things worse." That only made them laugh harder. The shorter one grabbed at his shirt near the collar. "You talk too much." Tieu Lac's fingers tightened around the basket handle. She wanted to tell him to stop, to leave, not to get hurt because of her. But fear had locked every word inside her throat. All she could do was stand there and watch. And then the young man did something she did not expect. Instead of striking back, he twisted just enough to break the grip, then raised his voice toward the open market behind them. "Guard, over here! Someone call market security!" His voice cut cleanly through the noise. That changed everything. The two troublemakers froze. The taller one cursed under his breath. "You little..." But the young man had already stepped back and shouted again, louder this time. "Security! These two are causing trouble." The market reacted at once. Heads turned fully. Vendors rose from their stools. A woman pointed. Someone farther away repeated the shout. The word security traveled faster than courage ever had. The people who had been silent moments earlier suddenly found their voices, their concern, and their attention. The two young men felt it too. The shorter one glanced over his shoulder, clearly unsettled. "Forget it. Let's go." The taller one still looked furious, but his confidence had cracked. He jabbed a finger toward the stranger. "This isn't over." The young man didn't answer. He didn't need to. Two market guards were already hurrying over from the far side, drawn by the shouting and the sudden commotion. One was older, broad-shouldered, with the hard expression of someone used to dragging trouble away before it spread. The other followed right behind him. The instant the troublemakers saw them, their courage vanished. The taller one clicked his tongue and shot Tieu Lac one last nasty look. Then both of them turned and pushed into the crowd, disappearing quickly between the stalls. The guards rushed after them while several vendors pointed out which way they had gone. And just like that, it was over. The crowd loosened. The tight circle of tension dissolved. Voices resumed, now mixed with murmurs about what had happened. Some people shook their heads as if they had cared all along. Some muttered that those boys were always causing problems. Others looked at Tieu Lac with awkward sympathy now that the danger had passed. Tieu Lac barely heard them. Her heart was still racing. Her knees felt weak. She stood there clutching the basket as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. The young man turned toward her. Up close, he looked even more like someone who worked with his hands all day. There were scratches on one arm. Dust clung to the hem of his trousers. His hands were rough. But now that the danger was gone, his expression was surprisingly gentle. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was so simple that for a second Tieu Lac didn't know how to answer. No one had asked her that all day. She looked at him and nodded faintly. I think so. He glanced at the basket. One skewer had been crushed, another had a bite missing. Did they take anything else? She shook her head. No, just that. He nodded once. That's good. For a brief moment, the two of them stood there in the middle of the noisy market, strangely still while everything around them returned to normal. Festival music drifted back into the edges of the moment. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed again. A vendor resumed calling out prices like nothing had happened. But for Tieu Lac, something had changed, because she was looking at the one person who had stepped in when no one else would. Thank you, she said softly. If you hadn't come, I don't know what would have happened. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking a little embarrassed. It's nothing. I was just nearby. But Tieu Lac knew that wasn't true. Many people had been nearby. Only one had chosen to act. She lowered her eyes for a second, then looked back up. Still, thank you. He gave a small smile. It wasn't the polished smile of someone trying to impress her. It was brief, almost shy, and that somehow made it feel warmer. You're okay now, he said. That's what matters. Before Tieu Lac could say anything else, a loud voice shouted from farther down the market. Hey, where's that repair boy? Come here quickly. This cartwheel is about to fall off. The young man turned at once. A vendor 2 rows away was waving frantically beside a wooden cart tilted at an awkward angle. Several milk cans stacked on top were rattling dangerously. The young man let out a quiet breath, like this was a normal part of his day. Then he looked back at Tieu Lac. I have to go help. Tieu Lac blinked. You repair things? A bit of everything, he said with a quick smile. Wheels, carts, shelves, whatever people need. The voice called out again, louder this time. He took a small step back. Stay near the busier part of the market for a while. It'll be safer. Tieu Lac nodded, though she suddenly didn't want him to leave so quickly. He seemed about to say something more, but the vendor shouted again, and the moment broke. I really have to go, he said. Before Tieu Lac could ask his name, before she could even think of what to say next, he turned and hurried away through the crowd toward the broken cart and the anxious milk seller calling for help. Tieu Lac stood still, watching him go. His dusty figure moved farther and farther through the market until it became just another shape among many. And yet, to her, it did not feel ordinary at all. Her eyes followed him for as long as they could. Something quiet and unfamiliar had settled in her chest, something softer than fear and lighter than sorrow. She did not know his name. She did not know where he came from. She only knew that when everyone else had looked away, he had stepped forward. And as Tieu Lac stood there in the fading light of the spring market, fingers still resting on the basket handle, her heart began to wonder one impossible thing. In a lively spring market filled with music, laughter, and busy voices, Tieu Lac suddenly finds herself trapped by 2 rude young men who mock and intimidate her while no one dares to help. Fear closes around her as the crowd only watches from a distance. Just when she feels completely alone, a dusty young repairman steps forward and calmly tells them to leave her alone. Though he looks ordinary, his courage is not. Instead of fighting recklessly, he cleverly calls for market security, forcing the troublemakers to flee. Once the danger passes, he gently asks if she is all right, showing a kindness no one else offered. Before Tieu Lac can even learn his name, he is called away to help fix a broken cart. Watching him disappear into the crowd, she is left with one unforgettable thought. Will fate ever let her see him again?